He was not born a monster. He was born a prince, watched, worshipped, and untouchable. The Roman people loved him before he ever spoke a single word. They called him their brightest star, their greatest hope, the son of a legend. And then he became emperor. And within 12 months, the most powerful senate in human history was reduced to trembling men who could not sleep at night, not because of his armies, not because of his weapons, but because of something far more terrifying: his mind. Here is what most historians get wrong about Caligula. They call him mad, they call him insane. They say power broke him, that the throne consumed a good man and left behind a monster. But what if that story is a lie? What if Caligula was never broken at all? What if everything, every humiliation he forced upon Rome's elite, every declaration that made senators tremble, every calculated act of cruelty was not madness, but strategy? What if Caligula looked at the most powerful empire in human history and decided the most effective weapon he could use was not a sword, but fear itself? By the end of this video, you will never look at power the same way again, because what Caligula understood about human psychology 2,000 years ago is something that the darkest minds of our own time still use today. This is not just the story of a Roman emperor. This is a masterclass in psychological terror. To understand what Caligula became, you must first understand what Caligula survived. He was born Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus in 12 AD. His father was Germanicus, Rome's greatest general, beloved by the people, feared by enemies, and trusted by legions across the empire. His mother was Agrippina the Elder, a woman of iron will and fierce political ambition. Together, they were Rome's most celebrated family. And Gaius grew up in army camps. As a small child, the soldiers adored him. They dressed him in tiny military boots, Caligula, and gave him the nickname that history would remember forever: Caligula. Little Boot, he was their mascot, their joy. A small boy running through military camps while his father commanded the greatest army in the world. But that world did not last. When Caligula was 7 years old, his father Germanicus died under circumstances that were suspicious. The rumors spread immediately. He had been poisoned, ordered dead by Emperor Tiberius himself, who feared Germanicus's popularity threatened the throne. Caligula watched his family collapse. His mother was arrested, exiled. She starved herself to death in prison. His brothers, one by one, were imprisoned, exiled, and killed, all under the orders of Tiberius. And where was Caligula during all of this? He was brought to live with Tiberius himself, on the island of Capri, in the private villa of the man who most historians believe destroyed his entire family. Think about that for a moment. A young boy watching his mother dragged away in chains, watching his brothers disappear, and then being forced to live, smile, and dine every single day with the man he believed was responsible. Now here is what most people miss about this chapter of Caligula's life. He survived it, not just physically, but psychologically. For years, Caligula lived in Tiberius's court, surrounded by enemies, surrounded by people who reported his every word, his every expression, his every reaction back to the emperor. And he learned something extraordinary. He learned to mask everything. The Roman historian Tacitus noted that no one, not a single person in Tiberius's court, could ever read what Caligula was truly feeling. He smiled when he was furious. He was calm when others expected grief. He showed loyalty to the man he may have despised. This was not weakness. This was the first lesson of psychological power. Control your face, and you control other people's reality. Caligula was not broken by his childhood. He was forged by it. And when Tiberius finally died in 37 AD, and the throne of the Roman Empire passed to Caligula, Rome had no idea what was coming. The first 6 months of Caligula's reign were extraordinary. He released political prisoners. He ended the treason trials that Tiberius had used to terrorize the Senate for years. He gave generous bonuses to the military. He staged spectacular gladiatorial games that the people of Rome had not seen in years. Rome went mad with joy. The crowds chanted his name. The Senate praised him as a God-sent ruler. Ancient sources recalled that in the first months of his reign, over 160,000 animals were sacrificed in celebration across the empire. And Caligula let them celebrate. He watched. He studied. He observed exactly who was loyal, who was performing loyalty, and who was simply relieved that Tiberius was dead. But then, something shifted. Approximately 7 months into his reign, Caligula fell severely ill. The nature of the illness is debated by historians. Some suggest it was physical, others suggest it may have been psychological. What is not debated is what happened when he recovered. He was a different ruler. Or perhaps he finally stopped pretending to be the ruler Rome wanted him to be. The first move was surgical. He recalled his grandmother Antonia's close friend and his own coheir Tiberius Gemellus and had him executed. The official reason was almost insultingly thin, but the message was not about the reason. The message was about the act itself. No one is safe. Not even family. Not even those I smiled at yesterday. Next came the information war. Caligula began surrounding himself with freedmen and personal allies, bypassing the traditional channels of the Senate entirely. He stopped consulting the Senate on decisions they expected to be consulted on. He made appointments, announcements, and policy changes without warning and without explanation. This was deliberate. When power is unpredictable, when the rules change without warning, people cannot form plans against you. They are too busy trying to understand what the rules even are. Machiavelli would write about this exact principle 15 centuries later. The prince who keeps his subjects uncertain keeps them controllable. Caligula understood it intuitively, but the most psychologically sophisticated move came next. Caligula began what historians now recognize as a systematic destruction of the dignity of Rome's most powerful men. He forced senators, men of ancient noble families, to run alongside his chariot for miles in their togas like servants. He summoned powerful consuls to his presence and then ignored them for hours while he attended to trivial matters, forcing them to simply stand and wait. He made prominent men's wives his guests at dinner, and then returned to the table and calmly described in graphic detail what had occurred with them. To their husbands, who could say nothing, who had to smile. This was not madness. This was a precise psychological operation, because here is what Caligula understood, and what most people never realize about power. The most dangerous enemy is not the man who hates you openly. The most dangerous enemy is the man who has dignity, self-respect, and the moral authority to lead others against you. Strip a man of his dignity, and you strip him of his power to resist. Now we arrive at the part of this story that history books never fully explain. Because what Caligula was doing was not random cruelty. It was a psychologically coherent system, and once you understand the system, you will see it everywhere. The first pillar was what psychologists today call unpredictable reinforcement. Caligula was never consistently cruel. He was unpredictably cruel and unpredictably generous. He would humiliate a senator one week and lavish him with gifts the next. He would threaten an execution and then laugh and embrace the condemned man. Modern psychology tells us that unpredictable reward and punishment cycles create the deepest psychological dependency and the most intense anxiety in human beings. It is the same mechanism behind trauma bonding, the same mechanism behind abusive relationships where victims cannot leave. The people around Caligula could never relax. They could never strategize against him, because they never knew which version of him they would face. The second pillar was the public performance of power. Everything Caligula did, he did publicly. The humiliations were public. The executions were public. The declarations were public. This was not ego. This was theater. Because public acts of power do not just affect the person they are directed at. They affect every single witness. Every senator who watched a colleague forced to run alongside the imperial chariot went home that night and thought about his own position, his own safety, his own vulnerability. Caligula was not managing individuals. He was managing the psychological state of an entire class of people simultaneously. Carl Jung wrote about what he called the shadow, the part of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge, our deepest fears, our most suppressed vulnerabilities. Caligula had an extraordinary gift for identifying the shadow of powerful men and forcing it into the light, publicly, where it could never be hidden again. A man who has been publicly humiliated by the emperor cannot pretend it did not happen. It is witnessed, it is known, it becomes part of how others see him, and more dangerously, how he sees himself. The third pillar, and perhaps the most sophisticated, was what we might call reality distortion. Caligula declared himself a living god. Now, historians have laughed at this for centuries, evidence of his madness, they say, his break from reality. But consider the actual effect of that declaration. If Caligula is a man, he can be opposed, judged, conspired against, and killed by other men who believe themselves his equals or superiors. If Caligula is a god, the entire psychological framework of opposition collapses. How do you justify plotting against a god? How do you recruit conspirators when the act itself feels, at some deep, irrational level, like sacrilege? The declaration was not about Caligula believing he was divine. It was about making everyone else uncertain enough about the boundaries of reality that they could not act with confidence. This is precisely what Robert Greene describes in the 48 Laws of Power. Create an aura around yourself that is larger than reality, and people will struggle to engage with you on human terms. Caligula created an aura so extreme, so deliberately, aggressively supernatural, that the normal rules of Roman political opposition became almost impossible to apply. The fourth pillar was the most personal and the most devastating: the weaponization of information. Caligula maintained a network of informants throughout Rome, but unlike Tiberius, who used informants to gather evidence for trials, Caligula used information differently. He would summon a senator, look at him calmly, and then mention, casually, as if discussing the weather, a private conversation that senator had with his wife 3 days ago, in his own home. The effect was not about what Caligula knew. The effect was about what the senator now believed Caligula might know. Once you create the impression of total surveillance, you do not need total surveillance. People begin to police themselves. They become paralyzed. Because the most terrifying prison is not one with visible walls, it is one where the prisoner cannot determine where the walls are. And yet, Caligula fell. In January of 41 AD, less than 4 years into his reign, a group of Praetorian Guard officers led by Cassius Chaerea assassinated him in a corridor beneath the Palatine Games. He was 28 years old, so if the system was so sophisticated, if the psychological control was so complete, why did it fail? This is the most important lesson in this entire story, because Caligula made one critical error, an error that Machiavelli would identify as fatal for any ruler operating through fear. He forgot the difference between fear that paralyzes and fear that eventually demands release. The psychological terror worked brilliantly on the Senate, men of words and politics who had no direct access to physical power, but Caligula applied the same tactics to the Praetorian Guard, the men who held swords. Cassius Chaerea, the officer who led the assassination, had been subjected to repeated public humiliations by Caligula. Caligula would mock his voice in front of crowds, would assign him obscene watchwords as part of the daily military routine, a profound insult to a decorated military man. Caligula broke the dignity of a man who had both the access and the means to act. This is the razor's edge of psychological power, and Caligula crossed it. There is a second lesson in the fall. Caligula had built his control entirely on personal presence, on the terror of his immediate, unpredictable reaction. Unlike truly durable power, which builds institutions, loyalties, and systems that survive the ruler, Caligula's power was entirely dependent on him being alive and present. The moment the blade fell, the entire structure collapsed. His wife was killed. His infant daughter was killed. His name was ordered removed from public records. 4 years of psychological domination, erased in an afternoon. Because power built on terror alone has no foundation beneath it. It is an empire built on sand, and when the tide comes, it vanishes completely. So what do we do with this story? We can call Caligula a monster. We can dismiss him as a madman. We can shake our heads and move on, but that would be the comfortable choice. The uncomfortable truth is this: every single psychological tactic Caligula used in 1st century Rome is being used today. Unpredictable reinforcement, used by abusive partners, manipulative managers, and authoritarian leaders across the modern world. Public humiliation as control. Watch any workplace bully, any political leader who mocks opponents in public, any system that makes examples of individuals to silence entire groups. Reality distortion, the deliberate creation of confusion about what is true, what is real, what the rules actually are, has become perhaps the defining feature of modern political power. The weaponization of information, the feeling of total surveillance, whether real or manufactured, silences entire populations. Caligula did not invent these tactics. He simply ran them at maximum intensity, with no restraint, no camouflage, no diplomatic softening, for the entire world of Rome to witness. And that is precisely why his story still matters, not as a history lesson, as a warning. Because the most dangerous version of these tactics is not the one applied by a Roman emperor 2,000 years ago. It is the subtle, modern, socially acceptable version, the one you might not recognize until you realize you have been running alongside the chariot for years and never once asked yourself why. Marcus Aurelius, who sat on the same throne as Caligula barely a century later, wrote in his Meditations, "The object of life is not to be on the side of the majority, but to escape finding oneself in the ranks of the insane. Study power, understand it, not to wield it without conscience, but so that you are never again controlled by those who do." If this video made you think differently about power, the next chapter goes even deeper, because the man who studied Caligula's Rome and turned it into the most dangerous political manual in human history is waiting.